Hello everyone, and I'd like to thank Greg for the opportunity to present to you virtually. I'm very sorry to say I can't be with you. I'm teaching at this very time. I'm here to do a short presentation today of my paper with my co-authors Liang, Shapiro and Carney. It's a paper essentially about state capitalism, and it's about the performance of state-owned firms. In this paper we have two research questions. The first is whether state-owned enterprises, SOEs, perform better than privately owned ones when we're looking at emerging markets. The second question concerns whether the performance of those SOEs in these understudied countries, as they're usually referred to, is in fact context-specific. That is to say, does the performance depend on the institutional system to which a country is classified? Our approach here, methodologically, is to use a gigantic data set, using firm-level data of about 50,000 firms in 57 understudied countries. These countries, some of which are capitalist, some are former socialist, some of which are state capitalist, and there are several other categories I'll talk about later. To summarize the findings that I'm going to refer to today, firstly, we do find that unlike much of the literature about Western SOEs, we find SOEs in these countries do display productivity advantages. Secondly, we find that the so-called state-led economic systems, or state capitalist economic systems, provide strong institutional support for these ownership advantages of state-owned firms. That is to say, the state-owned firms really only perform better in economic systems which support state-owned firms. Let me just give a little bit of background to this. You'll all be aware of all of this, I'm sure. I mean, the Washington Consensus would always have argued that a market economy is the only efficient resource allocation mechanism. And therefore, we saw policies really from the late 1980s suggesting that, for example, state-owned firms should be replaced by private ones through the process of privatization. The problem with this argument is that it's not really consistent with a very rapid rise of non-liberal market economies across much of Asia and some of Africa, most notably the rise of China. It's also the case that this very simplistic division between socialism and capitalism ignores the evolution of more nuanced types of economic systems, especially in the understudied countries to which I'll be referring. So what I'm going to do is look at the impact of state ownership on firm performance, whether it's sensitive to institutional context. And by institutional context, I'm not, as has often been done, going to look at institutions per se, but I'm going to take a systemic approach to the notion of institutions. Well, I don't need to tell this audience about the literature on state-owned firms and privately owned firms. There's a huge literature that says that privately owned firms will outperform, particularly for developed economies, for market economies and for middle-income countries. I've got some of the references up there. In transition economies, there was an enormous argument saying that privatization would improve performance, although, as amongst others, my own paper in the Journal of Economic Literature found that such results were very highly context-specific. In this paper, I'm going to focus on the impact of national institutional systems. And to do so, I'm not going to invent my own structure of institutional systems. I'm going to look at what's called the WBES configurations. Now, the WBES, the Varieties of Institutional System Configuration, was developed in this paper here by Feinschmidt et al. And what they did is they used fuzzy set analysis across a large number of institutional indicators, to develop a categorization, a taxonomy of 7 distinct and empirically derived institutional systems that they term configurations, and this is the paper that lays that out. The configurations, the two traditional varieties of capitalism configurations, market-based and collaborative, are also in their work, but the new configurations for understudied countries are state-led, fragile state, family-led, tribal, emergent liberal market economies, emergent collaborative economies, and hierarchical economies. So that is their 7 countries, 7 systems, sorry. What we're going to do is we're going to look at performance of firms. We're going to use productivity measured somewhat imperfectly, but it's the only thing in the data, by real sales per worker. We're going to use as key dependent variables a state ownership dummy, and we're going to look at state ownership dummy interacted with the configuration in which the firm is based. There are going to be a number of controls both at the firm level and at the country level, and there are going to be system-wide controls, and in some regressions there are also country-specific controls. So this is the equation that we're going to be estimating. Productivity essentially given controls as a function of state ownership and state ownership times configuration. So what do we find? We find that the coefficient on state ownership is positive and significant in all the relevant models. That is, that state ownership actually improves productivity ceteris paribus. We also find that the coefficients on configurations are significant. That is to say that this institutional system structure devised, the BIS structure, is able to explain differences in performance of firms. When we actually include the interaction between configurations and the state-owned dummy, we find that state-owned firms are not in general more productive. That is to say, in liberal market economies, in collaborative market economies, in all the other systems, actually state ownership does not generate better performance. State ownership only generates significantly better performance in state-led or state capitalist configuration. So that's our key result. And these are the regressions that show this. Obviously it's very, very quick, but you can see the results of this SOE dummy, and then that disappears in this regression where we have the interaction of X, and instead the interaction effect is the variable that's significant. So in conclusion, what have we shown? We've shown that the categories of institutional system provides an independent and statistically significant explanation of the variation in firm performance across countries. I hope this begins to bring back into favour a more nuanced view of the idea that is important to compare economic systems. Secondly, we find that state-owned firms are not necessarily inferior to privately owned firms, especially when we start looking at these understudied or much underdeveloped countries. And lastly, we find that the superior performance of state-owned firms is associated with the fact that the configurations are state-led. That is to say, state-owned firms perform well in state-led or in state capitalist systems, but not in others. Thank you very much.